Hi everybody, and welcome back to Dark Hollow. This video that I'm going to do tonight was actually inspired by some debunkers that I watch. The Shape and Beardo, the side-eye guy, who watch the paranormal videos that you find on YouTube, and they go through and try to prove on how they're making some of this stuff up. And like a lot of people, I used to, really be into these paranormal videos because I want to know, I want to see proof. Is there something out there, just because of experiences I've had myself? But they did debunk one video of some very popular YouTubers, and the way that they debunked them was from they were like cracking their toes and their joints and different stuff like that to make tapping noises. And as I watched them and heard them explain this, I remember that I had heard about this from like a long time ago. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. Now, I am not going to mention the videos that they debunked. Go check out those guys. Like I said, it's The Shape, Beardo Gets Scared, and the Side-Eye Guy. You can find their videos here on YouTube, and they do a really good job, and they do a lot of humor with it as well. But what I'm going to be talking to you tonight about are the Fox sisters. And they were three sisters from Rochester, New York. And they played a really important role in the creation of spiritualism. But the thing is, it all started with just a prank. So, in 1848, the two youngest sisters, Catherine, or as she went by Kate, was born on March the 27th in 1837, and Margareta, or Maggie, was born on October the 7th, 1833, and they lived with their parents, John and Margaret, in Hydesville, New York. Now, the girls had been born and raised near Consacon. Pardon me if I have totally screwed that up. But it's a tiny village in Prince Edward County in Ontario, Canada. And their father owned a farm there. But the family moved to Hydesville in New York of 1847. Now, on a late March day in 1848, Maggie, who was 14, and Kate, who was 11, stopped one of their neighbors and wanted to tell them about this really frightening phenomenon that had been happening in their house. They said every night around bedtime, they heard a series of raps on the wall and furniture, and taps that seemed to manifest with an otherworldly intelligence. Now, the neighbor, who was skeptical, of course, came to see for herself, and she joined the girls in a small bedroom that they shared with their parents. Now, while Maggie and Kate huddled together on their bed, their mother, Margaret, began the demonstration. And she said to the spirit that these girls were claiming, she said, "Now count to 5." And the room shook, so they said, with the sound of 5 heavy thuds. "Count to 15, she commanded, and the mysterious presence obeyed. Next, she asked it to tell the neighbor's age. 33 distinct taps followed. And she asked then If you are an injured spirit, manifest it by 3 taps, and it did. Now, Margaret Fox did not seem to consider the date, which was March 31st, April Fool's Eve, and the possibility that her daughters were not frightened by a ghost or a spirit, but probably by the unexpected success of their prank. The Fox family deserted the house and sent Maggie and Kate to live with their older sister, Leah Fox Fish, born April 8th, 1813, in Rochester. Now, the story might have ended there if it weren't for the fact that Rochester was a hotbed for reform and religious activity. Now, the same vicinity that they went to, the Finger Lakes region of New York State, gave birth to both Mormonism and Millerism. And Millerism was the precursor to the Seventh-day Adventist. Two community leaders, Isaac and Amy Post, were obviously intrigued by the sister stories and by the rumor that the spirit likely belonged to a peddler who had been murdered in the farmhouse 5 years beforehand. A group of Rochester residents examined the cellar of the Fox home and uncovered strands of hair and what appeared to be bone fragments. Now, Amy and Isaac Post were, in their time, considered radical Quakers. And given the time period, the reason they were considered radical is because they believed in such things as abolition, temperance, and equal rights for women. I mean, radical thinking. But for the time, it really was. They were also long-standing friends of the Fox family. So the Posts invited the girls to a gathering at their home, anxious to see if they could communicate with the spirits in another location. Isaac Post said, "I suppose I went with as much unbelief as Thomas felt when he was introduced to Jesus after he had ascended. But he was swayed," he says, "by very distinct thumps under the floor and several apparent answers." He was further convinced when Leah Fox also proved to be a medium communicating with the Post's recently deceased daughter. Now, how horrible would that be that, your daughter has passed away and now you have somebody claiming they can talk to them. On November the 14th in 1849, the Fox sisters demonstrated their spiritualist rapping at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester. This was the first demonstration of spiritualism held before a paying public and inaugurated the long history of public events featured by spiritualist mediums and leaders in the United States and in other countries. After the demonstration, Amy Post accompanied the sisters to a private chamber where they disrobed and were examined by a committee of skeptics who found no evidence of a hoax. Immediately convinced of the genuineness of the phenomenon, they helped to spread the word among the radical Quaker friends who became the early core of spiritualists. Kate and Margaretta became famous mediums, and they held seances for hundreds of people. Many of these early seances were entirely frivolous, where sitters sought insight into the state of railway stocks or the issue of love affairs, things that a lot of people wouldn't consider very important, but that tells you about these are, probably the more high society people. Horace Greeley, the prominent publisher and politician, became a kind of protector for them, enabling their movement in higher social circles. Their public seances in New York in 1850 attracted notable people, although Greeley watched over the sisters. The lack of parental supervision was lacking as both of the young women began to drink wine. And you remember, you're 14, 15, 11, 12, and, who would let their children be watched over by someone else? The movement known as modern spiritualism sprang from several distinct revolutionary philosophies and characters. The ideas and practices of Franz Anton Mesmer, who was an 18th century Australian healer, had spread to the United States. Now, Mesmer proposed that everything in the universe, including the human body, was governed by a magnetic fluid that could become imbalanced, causing illness. By waving his hands over a person's body, he noticed a mesmerized hypnotic state that would allow him to manipulate the magnetic force and restore health. Amateur mesmerists or hypnotists became a popular attraction at parties, and a few providing skillful enough to attract paying customers. Some who awakened from a trance claimed to have experienced visions of spirits from another dimension. At the same time, the ideas of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century Swedish philosopher and mystic, also surged in popularity. Swedenborg described an afterlife consisting of 3 heavens, 3 hells, and an interim destination, the world of spirits, where everyone went immediately upon dying, and which was more or less similar to what they were already accustomed to on earth. And he claimed to have talked with the spirits on all of the planes. Now, 75 years later, the 19th century American seer Andrew Jackson Davis, who would become known as the John the Baptist of modern spiritualism, combined these two ideas, claiming that Swedenborg's spirit spoke to him during a seance of mesmeric trances. Davis recorded the content of these messages and in 1847 published them in a voluminous tome titled The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and a Voice to Mankind. It is a truth, he asserted, predicting the rise of spiritualism, that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other in the higher spheres. All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established. Davis believed his prediction materialized a year later on the very day the Fox sisters first channeled spirits in their bedroom. About daylight this morning, he confided to his diary, a warm breathing passed over my face, and I heard a voice, tender and strong, saying, "Brother, the good work has begun. Behold, a living demonstration is born." Upon hearing of the Rochester incident, Davis invited the Fox sisters to his home in New York City to witness their modern or medium capabilities for himself. Of course he did. Joining his cause with the sisters' ghostly manifestations elevated his stature from obscure prophet to recognized leader of a mass movement, one that appealed to increasing number of Americans inclined to reject the gloomy Calvinistic doctrine of predestination and embrace the reform-minded optimism of the mid-19th century. Unlike their Christian counterparts, Americans who adopted spiritualism believed they had a hand in their own salvation and direct communication with those who had passed offered insight into the ultimate fate of their own souls. Maggie Kate and Leah Fox embarked on a professional tour to spread the word of the spirits, booking a suite fittingly at Barnum's Hotel on the corner of Broadway and Maiden Lane, an establishment owned by a cousin of the famed showman. An editorial in the Scientific American scoffed at their arrival, calling the girls the spiritual knockers from Rochester. They conducted their seances in a hotel parlor, inviting as many as 30 attendees to gather around a huge table at the hours of 10 a.m., 5 p.m., 8 p.m., taking an occasional private meeting in between. Admission was $1, and visitors, including prominent members of New York society, Horace Greeley, the iconic and influential editor of the New York Tribune, James Fenimore Cooper, editor and poet, William Cullen Bryant, and abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who witnessed a session in which the spirits rapped in time to a popular song and spelled out a message. Spiritualism will work miracles in the cause of reform. Now, naturally, from the start, there were critics. So, beginning in 1850, some concluded that the girls made the rappings themselves, including physician E.P. Longworthy, John W. Hearn, Reverend John M. Austin, and Reverend D. Potts. In 1851, the Reverend C. Chauncey Burr wrote in the New York Tribune that by cracking toe joints, the sounds were so loud they could be heard in a large hall. In the same year, investigators from the University of Buffalo concluded that the raps were made by cracking joints of their body and that the raps would not occur if they had cushions under their feet. In 1851, Mrs. Norman Culver, a relative of the Fox sisters, admitted in a signed affidavit that she had assisted them during their seances by touching them to indicate when the raps should be made. She also claimed that Kate and Margaretta revealed to her the method of producing the raps by snapping their toes and using their knees and ankles. Charles Grafton Page, a patent examiner and patient advocate, had developed a keen eye for detecting fraudulent claims about science. In his book Psychomancy in 1853, Page observed that the rapping sounds came from underneath the girls' long dresses. If you watch the video that those three debunkers debunked, you will understand what connection it has to what I'm telling you now about the Fox sisters. Even amid criticism, though, the sisters toured and performed. Leah stayed in New York, entertaining callers in a seance room, while Kate and Maggie took the show to other cities, among them Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, where one visitor, explorer Elijah Kent Kane, became infatuated by Maggie. Even though he deemed her a fraud, he couldn't prove how the sounds were made. And he said, after a whole month's trial, I could make nothing of them. And he confessed, therefore, they are a great mystery. He courted Maggie, who was 13 years his junior, and encouraged her to give up her life of suspected deceit. She agreed, retiring to attend school at Kane's behest and expense, and married him shortly before his untimely death in 1857. To honor his memory, she converted to Catholicism, as he was a Presbyterian. He had always encouraged her to become Catholic. He seemed to think that the faith's ornate iconography and sense of mystery would appeal to her. In mourning, she began to drink heavily. In 1857, the Boston Courier set up a prize of $500 to any medium who could demonstrate a paranormal ability to their committee. The Fox sisters made an attempt and were investigated by a committee which included the magician John Weinman. The committee concluded that the raps were produced by bone and feet movements, and thus the Fox sisters failed the challenge. Kate, meanwhile, married a devout spiritualist and continued to develop her medium powers, translating spirit messages into astonishing and unprecedented ways, communicating two messages simultaneously, writing one while speaking the other, transcribing messages in reverse script, utilizing blank cards upon which words seem to spontaneously appear. During sessions with a wealthy banker, Charles Livermore, she summoned both the man's deceased wife and the ghost of Benjamin Franklin, who announced his identity by writing his name on a card. Her business boomed during and after the Civil War as increasing members of the bereaved found solace in spiritualism. Prominent spiritualist Emma Hardings wrote that the war added 2 million new believers to the movement, and by the 1880s there were an established 8 million spiritualists in the United States and Europe. These new practitioners, seduced by the flamboyance of the Gilded Age, expected miracles, like Kate's summoning of full-fledged apparitions at every seance. It was wearing to both the movement and to Kate herself, and she too began to drink heavily. Kate was examined by William Crookes, the prominent physicist between 1871 and 1874, who concluded the raps were genuine. However, Crooks was described as gullible, and the mediums he investigated were caught using trickery. Harry Houdini, the magician who devoted a large part of his life to debunking spiritualist claims, provided this insight. As to the delusion of sound, sound waves are deflected just as light waves are reflected by the intervention of a proper medium, and under certain conditions it is a difficult thing to locate their source. Kate had traveled to England in 1871, the trip paid for by a wealthy New York banker, so she would not be compelled to accept payment for her services as a medium. The trip was apparently considered a missionary work, since Kate sat only for prominent people who would let their names be printed as witnesses to a seance. In 1872, Kate married H.D. Jenkin, a London barrister, legal scholar, and enthusiastic spiritualist. Jenkin died in 1881, leaving Kate with 2 sons. In 1878, Margaretta joined her sister Kate, who was still living in England. Over the years, Sister Kate and Margaretta had developed serious drinking problems. Around 1888, they became embroiled in a quarrel with their sister Leah and other leading spiritualists, who were concerned that Kate was drinking too much to care for her children. At the same time, Margaretta, contemplating a return to the Roman Catholic faith, became convinced that her powers were diabolical. On October 21st, 1888, the New York World published an interview with Maggie Fox in anticipation of her appearance that evening at the New York Academy of Music, where she would publicly denounce spiritualism. She was paid $1,500 for the exclusive. Her main motivation, however, was rage at her sister Leah and other leading spiritualists who had publicly chastised Kate for her drinking and accused her of being unable to care for her 2 young children. Kate planned to be in the audience when Maggie gave her speech, lending her support. And this is the speech that Maggie was supposed to have given that night. My sister Katie and myself were very young children when this horrible deception began, Maggie said. At night when we went to bed, we used to tie an apple on a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor. Or we would drop the apple on the floor, making a strange noise every time it would rebound. The sisters graduated from apple dropping to manipulating their knuckles, joints, and toes to make rapping sounds. A great many people, when they hear the rapping, imagine at once that the spirits are touching them, she explained. It is a very common delusion. Some very wealthy people came to see me some years ago when I lived in 42nd Street, and I did some rappings for them. I made the spirit rap on the chair, and one of the ladies cried out, "I feel the spirit tapping me on the shoulder." Of course, that was pure imagination. You have to excuse my dog barking in the background. She offered a demonstration, removing her shoe and placing her right foot upon a wooden stool. The room fell silent and still, and was rewarded with a number of short little raps. There stood a black-robed, sharp-faced widow, the New York Herald reported, working her big toe and solemnly declaring that it was in this way she created the excitement that had driven so many persons to suicide or insanity. One moment it was ludicrous, the next it was weird, Maggie insisted. Maggie insisted that her sister Leah knew that the rappings were fake all along and greedily exploited her younger sisters. Before exiting the stage, she thanked God that she was able to expose spiritualism. The mainstream press called the incident a death blow to the movement, and spiritualists quickly took sides. Shortly after Maggie's confession, the spirit of Samuel B. Britton, former publisher of the Spiritual Telegraph, appeared during a seance to offer a sympathetic opinion. Although Maggie was an authentic medium, he acknowledged, the band of spirits attending during the early part of her career has been usurped by other unseen intelligences who are not scrupulous in their dealings with humanity. Other living spiritualists charged that Maggie's change of heart was wholly mercenary. Since she had failed to make a living as a medium, she sought to profit by becoming one of spiritualism's fiercest critics. Whatever her motivation, Maggie recounted her confession a year later, insisting that her spirit guide had beseeched her to do so. Her reversal of attitude prompted more disgust from the devoted spiritualists, of course, many of whom failed to recognize her as a subsequent debate at the Manhattan Liberal Club. There, Maggie, under the pseudonym Mrs. Spencer, she revealed several tricks of the profession, including the way mediums wrote messages on blank slates by using their teeth or feet. Leah, on the death of her first husband, married a successful Wall Street banker. Kate died at her home in New York City on July 3rd, 1892. Less than a year later, Margaretta, deep in alcoholism, was living on charity as the sole tenant of an old tenement house. She was taken to the home of spiritualist Mrs. Emily B. Records in Brooklyn, where she died on March 8th, 1893. Leah was the last to pass away on November 1st, 1890. Yeah. Having never reconciled with her sisters, all three sisters are interred in Brooklyn, New York. Margaretta and Catherine in Cypress Hill Cemetery, and Leah with the Fox family in Greenwood Cemetery. That year, spiritualists formed the National Spiritualist Association, which today is known as the National Spiritualist Association of Churches. In 1904, school children playing in the sisters' childhood home in Hydesville, known locally as the Spook House, discovered the majority of a skeleton between the earth and crumbling cellar walls. A doctor who estimated that the bones were about 50 years old, giving credence to the sisters' tales of spiritual messages from a murdered peddler. But not everybody was convinced. The New York Times reported that the bones had created a stir amusingly disproportionate to any necessary significance of the discovery, and suggested that the sisters had merely been clever enough to exploit a local mystery. Even if the bones were that of the murdered peddler, the Time concluded, there will still remain that dreadful confession about the clicking joints, which reduces the whole case to a farce. 5 years later, another doctor examined the skeleton and determined that it was made up of only a few ribs with odds and ends of bones, and among them a superabundance of some and a deficiency of others. Among them also were some chicken bones. He also reported a rumor that a man living near the spook house had planted the bones as a practical joke, but was much too ashamed to come clean. So, I think some of these YouTubers and stuff that go out and are getting all this so-called phenomenon and everything, while they could be entertaining, and like I said, I was taking in, I used to watch them, and I would think, oh my gosh, that, because some of them were convincing, but then again, I didn't know what to look for. But they're not inventing anything new. I mean, obviously with the creation of computers and editing and all that thing that can do, really good stuff that's hard to spot. But as far as faking phenomenon and making money off of it, it's nothing new. There's always been people out there trying to apparently make $1 on getting people to believe things. So, anyway, if you liked this video, please like and share. It gives, or like and subscribe, because it really helps out a lot. It doesn't cost anything. If you subscribe, I mean, it doesn't cost you anything just to have I think you have to have a YouTube account, or at least an email. But other than that, it doesn't cost you anything, but it helps me out a lot. And if you like this content, keep coming back. And I will see you in the shadows.